The gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. I stand before you this morning a broken and sore man. My two nephews, who are the same ages as my two children, are visiting with the family and with my in-laws this weekend. And to get everybody out of the house yesterday, we went to this place called Jump Street. I think you probably are familiar with Jump Street. It's a trampoline park. Jump Street is made for kids, not for 34-year-olds. But I thought I would get in there anyway. And I had what is known as, I think kids, they just call it, like, you had a fail, right? That's what they call it. It's not a verb anymore. It's a noun. It's something you have. So I was in the midst of this moment where I was going to do something I've really never done before, and that's do a backflip. And I left and, like, in this area, before my feet left the trampoline, something said, But of course, my body was committed. But you can sort of see in the moment, like, the commitment wavered a great deal. So it resulted in me just landing on my face. I can actually show this to you because one of my loving family members decided to catch it. Oh, yeah. Pretty good, right? Yep. Perfection is not made overnight, people. I'll get there. I can bring that up to you today without even a shred of embarrassment because two other people are having a worse week than I am. One of those folks is Joel Osteen, and we'll talk about him in a second. And the other one is our dear friend St. Peter, who had a pretty bad day today. And I'm glad that both of them had a worse day than my trampoline park day. All three of us committed the same sin, though. Each one of us in our own way, somewhere between what we thought was the right jump and landing it, we kind of screwed up a little bit. And we got a little bit of a misunderstanding about what it is we're actually even doing. Even if our brain or our soul knew one thing, our body was saying something else, right? Joel Osteen, for whatever it is that happened, those of you who don't know, he's come under a lot of criticism because at some point, people expected him to open the doors of the Compact Center that seats 22,000 people or so to allow for folks seeking refuge in the midst of Hurricane Harvey to come and find a place of shelter. And there are all sorts of reasons that he gave that it didn't happen the way that people thought it should happen. And to be fair, look, his church and he are just as full of hypocrites as this church and me, okay? So we can do that game real quick and just sort of say, like, people are quick to point their finger at the church, and we deserve it most of the time, right? In this case, his defense also led to additional trouble, right? That what we might have said is somewhere in the midst of that move that they were trying to do to follow Jesus, something didn't quite go right, and that's what a fail looks like for a church. It could have just as easily been us, by the way. Peter, in the midst of following Jesus all the way to Jerusalem, when told that Jesus will go to Jerusalem to die, puts his foot in his mouth like Peter does and says, no, that can't possibly happen to you, Savior and Son of God, who has just told me that it's supposed to happen. No. I know better. I'm Peter. And Jesus calls him Satan and a stumbling block. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Remember last week when we heard, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church? This is just like a paragraph down. He doesn't keep that title for very long before he gets replaced with Satan and stumbling block. I've been there too. It happens that way. I think their primary failure, which is a little bit different than my trampoline park failure, is not so much that lack of zeal, but more a misunderstanding of how God's transformative work is unfolding, right? If we ever stop in the midst of God's transformative work and just look where we are, sometimes it just looks miserable. But over time, if we step back from it and look at it again, we see God's hand at work in such a way that even those miserable parts become a part of God's redemption. We can't blame Peter for not being able to understand that an instrument of torture and death would become God's instrument for healing and wholeness, right? That doesn't make any sense. How many of you are wearing a piece of jewelry today with a cross on it? Right? A lot of hands. We can't blame Peter for not knowing that 2,000 years later, he is standing within the view of, no doubt, people hanging on crosses that the empire has executed, that one day we would say, but you know what, we're going to make those pretty and put them on jewelry, and people are going to wear them to church one day. There's no way he could have understood that that's what God was up to. Changing a symbol of oppression and death into a symbol of hope and redemption. As Christians, we are called into a world in which we are formed that we might see patterns of God's behavior in the world, right? That's what we talk about when we talk about Christian formation. It's about how we get shaped into a pattern ourselves. But the more we learn about what God's been up to forever, the more we begin to see the way God's up to work right now, right? Seeing the cross in the world is one of those chief hallmarks of what it means to be a Christian. Being able to look into a world where an innocent victim is suffering and saying, you know what, I see a cross there. And I know what my God thinks about innocent victims. Being able to look into a world in which power, governmental power, oppresses someone. We look at that and we can see the cross, we can see the children of Israel, we can see the children of Israel, the Egyptians or the Babylonians. We can see that and say, I know what my God does when a people are being oppressed. When we look into the world and we see needless suffering or despair, we can look at that and say, I see that cross and I know what God does with that. Have a little bit of hope. We ought to be able to see that. And if we see it and we know what God is up to with crosses, what God's always up to, then we can understand why Jesus would say, pick up your cross and get in line behind me. Because we're going somewhere where God is going to take this cross and transform it. Maybe even into an instrument of healing for someone else. We can forgive Peter for not knowing, but we have a significant advantage over Peter. And that we get to see what God's done with that one cross and every cross after. And that includes your cross and our cross. So I invite you to consider for a moment what we do with our crosses if we're going to be like those people who are called to follow Jesus and get in behind him with our crosses in tow. The next time you look in the mirror and you see your cross, don't take the perspective of someone just standing in that moment of pain, but pray for the grace to see what God can do with pain and how that pain might be an instrument of healing for someone else. When I look at myself, usually, I don't let my prayer get there. I end up looking more like Peter. And like Peter, sometimes Jesus says to me, well, if you're not going to get behind me, you're just going to be standing in my way. The next time you look at your neighbor and you see their suffering or their pain or the thing that they are going through that is a cross to them, when you see that pattern, usually what I do is I think, well, they either made it for themselves. Some of my neighbors seem to deserve it. Or I just fall into that pattern of pity. None of those are what Jesus asks for. Instead, to be able to see what God is up to in their lives, that pain might one day be transformed. Not changed. Changed isn't enough. Change is slow and incremental. Transformation is an entirely different experience, right? To see how that might be, to pray for the transformation to occur. And that they might not be overwhelmed by the moment of process, but instead be comforted by the process that leads to transformation. When we look at our world, we should think the same thing. When we see those crosses in the world, we should pray that we can carry them well. That as we bring them to God, God might be able to transform them as we know God is. When we think about ourselves as a community, we should see those patterns in which we are being changed, sure, but where God is up to something to transform us. And if we stop in that process, it looks like just a moment in time, but pretty soon here we're going to be doing a lot of work to remember how God's been doing this transformative process in this church for 70 years. We can forgive somebody in 1951 for not ever being able to dream of what their toil would look like today. If they looked at it now, they would say, that's transformation. And I would say, amen. But in the moment, it would have been hard for them to have seen it. Have the ability to ask for the grace to see things that way, to have the perspective of Jesus as Jesus begins to walk toward his cross, and not the perspective of Peter, who all he can see is the pain. This past Friday, I had another one of those occasions that is truly a privilege to have as a priest. They are the occasions that allow me to think, maybe this really is what I am called to do. I visited a man at the McGraw Hospice Center. That's the one right next to Mayo Clinic, right? And as I even pulled in, suddenly I was so overwhelmed with the realization that I had made that drive and visited other people like him so many times. I even stopped in the parking lot to call one of the surviving spouses of a man who had died there just about a year ago. All that somehow preparing me for walking in and saying prayers with somebody else who is near death. This man, also not very old, one very young daughter. And as I went in, we talked about his cross. Cancer was going to take his life. He didn't have much fight left, just a little bit. And he was clearly suffering and would have more suffering to come. But as we talked, it dawned on me that what caused him the greatest suffering, what was his most burdensome cross, was the realization that as a father, he would soon not be able to be a parent to his daughter anymore. And that sense of, I am going to be abandoning him or abandoning her was crushing to him. As we talked through it, though, his wisdom, which came from a place of pain because he had lost his own parents at an early age, his wisdom started to shine forth. And he said, you know, the one thing that I know is if I have one breath left in my body, I might just be able to teach my daughter that you can't do much with the crosses that come into your world. We can't do much to stop there from being crosses in our world. In fact, it's a guarantee in this life that if we keep our eyes open and draw a breath, we will see pain and suffering in this world. The difference about us is what we do with it, how we respond to it. So if I have one more breath in my body, I will be able to tell my daughter something. I will be able to hold my cross in some way, that God might change this from just a moment that she remembers as painful to a moment that she might carry with her for hope. I thought about the way that we talk about Jesus stretching forth his arms on the hard wood of the cross, not as one being executed, but instead so that the whole world might come within the reach of his saving embrace. What a different way of looking at that. Yes, it's painful. It's tremendous. And it's filled with love. Just as this man's understanding is that while he still has any breath in his body, whatever that pain is can be filled with love, that his daughter might have enough love to carry her the rest of the days of her life. We have choices about what we do with the crosses that we face. We can hold tightly to them and not move. We can pretend like they are not there and let them crush us. Or we can have the grace to see this opportunity to pick them up, to get in line behind Peter and the disciples and every other Christian soul who has walked in line with Jesus, and bring them to God. Because like Peter and like Jesus, with enough faith, we can see that we're not so much concerned with what those crosses could do to us, but instead we are filled with faith about what God can do with those crosses. Amen.